Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to wander together through the quiet corridors of history. There's no rush, nowhere we need to be. Just stories unfolding gently, like pages turning in an old book discovered in a dusty library on a rainy afternoon. Before we begin our journey, if you're finding comfort in these tales, you might consider leaving a like on the video, or subscribing if you haven't already, but only if it feels right to you. There's no pressure here, and if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day or night it is in your corner of the world. It's always peaceful to know we're all connected, scattered across the globe, finding rest in these shared stories. Now, let us begin with something solid and enduring. Stone walls, ancient fortresses, the kind of architecture that was built to outlast everything. Wars, plagues, the passing of countless seasons, and yes, even tenants with questionable hygiene habits. The birth of stone sanctuaries, when the Roman Empire finally crumbled, like a great tree falling slowly in a silent forest, Europe found itself in a strange, uncertain sleep. Civilization, as it had been known, seemed to drift away into shadow. The continent became a patchwork of small territories, each one uncertain of its neighbors, each one ready to defend what little it possessed. In those dim centuries, sometimes called the Dark Ages, though that name feels too harsh for such a complicated time, people needed safety. They needed walls, not the grand marble columns of Rome, but something more practical, more immediate. Something that said, clearly and without poetry, this is ours, and we intend to keep it. The first answer to this need was simple, almost humble. Picture, if you will, a small hill, perhaps man-made, perhaps natural, rising gently from the landscape. Atop this hill sits a wooden tower, sturdy but temporary, surrounded by a fence. This was called a motte and bailey, the motte being the raised earth, the bailey being the courtyard below where daily life unfolded. These wooden fortifications appeared across the countryside like mushrooms after rain. They were quick to build, which was important when danger might arrive at any moment. They were affordable, which mattered when resources were scarce. A local lord could raise one in weeks rather than years, transforming a vulnerable piece of land into something resembling a stronghold. But wood, as anyone who has watched a candle burn knows, has a fundamental weakness. It's impermanent. It yields to flame as naturally as ice yields to sun. These early wooden castles lived under constant threat, not just from enemy torches, but from simple accidents, a knocked-over lantern, a lightning strike on a summer evening, even the persistent dampness of seasons turning year after year, rotting the timber from within. Medieval builders understood this. They called these structures temporary, knowing full well that temporary might mean a generation or two if they were fortunate. Raiders understood it too. They looked at wooden fortifications and saw kindling, saw opportunity. The weather itself seemed to conspire against these defenses, as wind and rain worked tirelessly to reclaim the wood back into the earth. And so, slowly, an idea took root. What if, instead of wood that burns and rots, they used something more permanent, something that could stand against fire, against time itself? Stone. The revolution in stone. The shift from wood to stone was not sudden. It couldn't be. Stone brought its own challenges, its own demands. It was heavy, requiring enormous effort to quarry, transport, and lift into place. It was expensive, draining the treasuries of even wealthy lords. And it required specialized knowledge. Masons who understood how weight distributed itself through walls, how arches could span open spaces without collapsing, how foundations needed to reach deep into the earth to support such massive structures. Building a stone castle was not a project measured in months, but in years, sometimes decades. Sometimes the lord who commissioned it would never see it completed. His son might be the one to finally walk through finished halls, or perhaps his grandson. These were monuments that transcended individual lifetimes, speaking to a deeper human desire for permanence, for leaving something behind that would endure. But oh, the advantages that stone offered. Fire could rage around it, and stone would merely grow warm, perhaps crack if the heat was truly intense, but it would not vanish into ash and smoke. Armies could hurl themselves against stone walls until exhaustion claimed them, and the stone would remain perhaps chipped, perhaps scarred, but fundamentally unmoved. And there was something else, something perhaps as important as the practical benefits. Stone spoke of power in a way that wood never could. A stone castle rising above the landscape declared, without words, that its owner commanded significant resources, enough wealth to afford the stone, enough influence to gather the labor, enough authority to demand such effort from the surrounding countryside. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, understood this psychology of stone perfectly. After their invasion, they scattered castles across the English landscape like someone sowing seeds. Within a century, over 1,000 stone fortresses dotted the countryside, each one a declaration of Norman authority, each one announcing to the local population that the world had changed, and these new rulers intended to stay. These early stone castles were not comfortable. Comfort, in fact, was barely a consideration. They were fortresses first, residences second, and damp, dark caves third. Windows were narrow slits, designed more for archery than for admitting light. There was no plumbing to speak of. Heat was difficult to maintain. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept warmth from spreading through the interior spaces. But they worked. They stood firm against siege and weather. And in a world where survival often felt uncertain, where danger lurked in the next valley or might arrive with the next season, these stone fortresses offered something precious: the ability to endure. The wooden fort had been humanity's hopeful attempt at safety, built quickly out of necessity. The stone castle was something else entirely, a declaration of permanence, a middle finger carved from rock and pointed at an uncertain future, the language of stone and status. Once those first stone castles began rising into European skies, something interesting happened. Medieval lords realized something that humans have understood throughout history. Safety is important, yes, but appearances can be even more important. A castle, they discovered, was not merely a place to hide when enemies approached. It was a statement. Every tower, every battlement, every carefully carved detail announced to the world, I am powerful, I am wealthy, I am quite possibly more important than you. In an age without social media, without newspapers, without any modern means of broadcasting one's status, a castle did all that work silently, constantly, simply by existing. And so, competition began. Lords looked at their neighbors' fortifications and thought, mine should be higher. They added towers when towers weren't strictly necessary. They built walls thicker than any siege engine of their time could threaten. They commissioned elaborate gatehouses that were more art than architecture, more statement than strategy. This wasn't entirely about vanity, though vanity certainly played its role. In the feudal system that governed medieval life, perception mattered tremendously. A lord who appeared weak might find his authority questioned, his borders tested, his vassals looking elsewhere for protection. But a lord whose castle dominated the horizon, whose walls seemed to touch the clouds, whose very shadow fell across multiple villages, such a lord commanded respect through simple, undeniable presence. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of today's skyscrapers. Those glass and steel towers that corporations build, not because they need quite that much height, but because height itself communicates power. The medieval castle served the same psychological purpose, declaring its owner's status to anyone with eyes to see. Of course, not every lord was a brilliant military strategist. Many were simply wealthy men with resources to spend and anxieties to soothe. Some built their castles in absolutely terrible locations. Swampy lowlands prone to flooding, cliff edges where supply routes were nearly impossible, locations chosen more for dramatic views than for any practical defensive advantage. But even these poorly positioned castles served their purpose. They looked impressive. They cast long shadows. They made peasants in the valley below look up each morning and remember who held power in this particular corner of the world. Inside these fortresses, life was less glamorous than the exterior suggested. Most lords lived in a state of low-grade paranoia. They worried about their servants, who had access to food stores and knowledge of the castle's layout. They worried about visiting nobles, who might be assessing weaknesses, even as they smiled over dinner. They locked their chambers at night. They installed defensive features in their own dining halls, places where they should have felt safest. Yet despite the discomfort, the cold, the damp, and the constant worry, these lords were creating something that would outlast them by centuries. Every castle required hundreds of workers, stonemasons, who understood their craft so intimately they could shape rock as if it were clay, carpenters who built the scaffolding that allowed masons to work at dizzying heights, smiths who forged the tools that carved the stone, and countless laborers who hauled materials up hills, across rivers, through forests. The design process was both art and intuition. There were no blueprints in the modern sense, no computer programs to calculate stress and load. Instead, master masons relied on knowledge passed down through generations, on rules of thumb developed over centuries, on mathematical ratios that worked even if no one could quite explain why. They used plumb lines and measuring ropes. They calculated proportions by eye. They made adjustments as they went, responding to the reality of the stone, the stability of the ground, the limitations of their tools. By the 12th century, castles had evolved into something beyond mere fortification. They were the ultimate status symbols of their age. A lord's castle announced his wealth more clearly than any verbal boast could. Visitors approaching from miles away would see the towers rising above the tree line and know, immediately, that they were entering the domain of someone with significant power. The message these structures sent was simple and undeniable. Approach if you must, but remember, my walls have walls, my defenses have defenses, and I built all of this to last longer than your lifetime, and your children's lifetimes, and the lifetimes beyond those. Foundations of defense, geography as guardian. In medieval architecture, one principle emerged as nearly universal. If you're going to build a castle, build it somewhere inconvenient, preferably somewhere difficult to reach, uncomfortable to approach, and absolutely exhausting to climb. The reasoning was simple, elegant even. Gravity, that constant and unpaid defender, worked best when it was working for you, rather than against you. A castle perched atop a steep hill transformed every step of approach into an ordeal for potential attackers. They would arrive at your gates already tired, already breathing hard, already questioning their life choices. This strategic use of elevation offered multiple advantages. From a high position, defenders could see for miles in every direction. Approaching armies couldn't surprise them. Merchants traveling nearby roads were visible long before they arrived at the gates. Even local villagers going about their daily work were within sight, which served the dual purpose of security and surveillance. Visibility worked both ways, of course. A castle on a hill could be seen from vast distances, which suited the lords perfectly. They wanted to be seen. They wanted every person in the surrounding countryside to look up at that stone crown on the hilltop and remember who held power here. What defenders gained in strategic advantage, they paid for in daily misery. Building materials had to be hauled up those same steep approaches. Every stone, every beam of wood, every barrel of supplies made the same exhausting journey upward. Oxen and horses struggled under the burden. Workers cursed under their breath, or perhaps not so quietly. The entire construction process became a battle against gravity that lasted years. Once built, the logistical challenges continued. Servants carrying food from kitchens to great halls might traverse multiple staircases, cross courtyards, pass through several doorways. If the Lord requested hot soup for dinner, it might arrive lukewarm at best, despite everyone's efforts. Water had to be hauled up, often from springs or wells at the base of the hill, making what should be a simple task into an exhausting daily chore. The aesthetic effect, though, was undeniable. From below, from the perspective of approaching travelers or potential enemies, the castle appeared almost divine. It seemed to grow from the mountaintop itself, as if God had placed it there as an unmovable monument. The walls caught the first light of dawn and glowed in the last rays of sunset. When fog rolled through the valleys, the castle might seem to float above the clouds, disconnected from the earthly realm entirely. From above, the view was less romantic. Fog didn't float poetically below. It rolled through the castle itself, bringing dampness that seeped into stone and cloth and never quite left. Wind, unobstructed by surrounding hills, battered the walls constantly, finding every crack, every window, every opening. In winter, these high fortresses became frozen fortresses where ice formed on the interior walls and breath clouded the air even indoors. Not every castle enjoyed the luxury of a perfect hill. Some perched on cliff edges, which provided excellent defensive advantages, but made life terrifying for anyone afraid of heights. Others sat on river bends or rocky ridges, working with whatever geography offered. Medieval lords had an obsession with altitude that seems almost modern in its intensity. A medieval version of real estate's most famous principle: location, location, location. Ultimately, the hill was more than just a defensive advantage. It was psychological warfare conducted through landscape. Every peasant in the valley looked up at that fortress daily. Every traveler passing through the region marked it as a landmark. The castle on the hill wasn't just a building, it was a constant, looming reminder that power lived above them, quite literally above them, and that power intended to stay there. Waters of discouragement, the moat. Now, let us speak of water, or rather, let us speak of what medieval lords did with water when they wanted to make their castles even more difficult to reach. The moat, that wide band of liquid disappointment that surrounded so many fortresses, was perhaps one of the most elegant solutions to a simple problem: how do you keep people away from your walls? The concept was beautiful in its simplicity. Dig a trench around your castle, preferably a deep one. Fill it with water if possible, and suddenly siege towers can't roll forward. Ladders become nearly useless. Soldiers attempting to swim across make excellent targets for archers standing comfortably on dry walls above. The moat was, in essence, medieval anti-personnel landscaping, a garden feature designed entirely around the concept of keeping humans at a distance. In theory, a proper moat was impressive. Imagine a ribbon of deep blue water, reflecting the sky and the castle walls, adding an element of beauty to the already imposing fortress. In practice, however, most moats were far less picturesque. They were often murky, stagnant pools that smelled of things best left undescribed. The water, unable to flow freely, would become a home for algae, insects, and whatever debris the wind or the castle's occupants added to it over time. The medieval moat was rarely the clear, romantic waterway we imagine today. Instead, picture something closer to a very large, very dirty puddle. Dead fish floating on the surface. Mosquitoes breeding in astronomical numbers. A smell that on particularly warm days could be detected from quite some distance away. But unpleasant as it was, it worked beautifully at its intended purpose. Not all moats contained water, which might come as a surprise. Some castles, particularly those built in areas where water was scarce or drainage was problematic, featured dry moats instead. These were simply deep ditches, often lined with stakes, thorns, or sharp rocks. A dry moat lacked the aesthetic appeal of its water-filled cousin, but it offered certain advantages. It was cheaper to maintain, it didn't breed disease-carrying insects, and most importantly, it was very effective at breaking the legs of anyone foolish enough to fall into it. Some particularly ambitious or paranoid lords built multiple moats, an outer moat to slow the initial advance, then perhaps a stretch of solid ground, then an inner moat closer to the walls. This forced attackers to solve the moat problem not once but twice, and by the second moat, most armies were thoroughly demoralized. There's something psychologically defeating about crossing a terrible obstacle only to discover an identical obstacle waiting just ahead. The real genius of the moat wasn't purely physical, though. It was psychological. Standing on one side of a wide, deep trench, looking across at high stone walls on the other side, an attacker had to consider, how do we get across? And once across, how do we get through those walls? And assuming we somehow manage both, what fresh horrors await us inside? The moat added a layer of difficulty that compounded with every other defensive feature, creating a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, attacking this particular castle wasn't worth the effort. Of course, moats came with their share of problems for the castle's inhabitants as well. They flooded during heavy rains, sometimes overflowing their banks and turning the castle grounds into a swamp. In winter, they froze, which eliminated their defensive value and sometimes created an unintentional bridge for invaders. During droughts, they dried up, leaving behind a muddy, foul-smelling trench that was somehow even less pleasant than when it had been filled with stagnant water. If your castle happened to sit near a river or stream, you might be fortunate enough to have a moat with flowing water. This was the luxury version, the moat that stayed relatively clear, that didn't smell quite so offensive, that served as both defense and a source of water for the castle. But castles with such advantages were rare. Most lords had to content themselves with whatever water they could divert or collect, creating moats that were more mud than water, more nuisance than majesty. Still, no self-respecting medieval lord would construct a castle without at least considering a moat. It was expected, like a bedroom in a house or wheels on a cart. The moat announced that you took defense seriously, that you were willing to invest in every possible layer of protection. When guests arrived, whether friendly visitors or potential enemies, they had to cross that moat, usually via a drawbridge, and in that crossing, they were reminded of their host's power and preparation. The drawbridge itself deserves mention. That wooden platform that could be raised or lowered, that could transform from pathway to barrier in moments, was a marvel of medieval engineering. When lowered, it invited approach. When raised, it became part of the wall itself, sealing the gateway. The heavy chains that lifted it, the counterweights that made the massive wooden structure movable, the guards who operated it, all of these represented significant investment and sophisticated mechanics. And so, the moat, whether filled with clear water, murky water, or no water at all, served its purpose admirably. It was a giant ring of discouragement, a wet or dry barrier that said to the world, "You're not even close to my walls yet, and already you have problems." In the hierarchy of medieval defensive features, the moat was perhaps not the most glamorous, but it was certainly among the most effective. A triumph of simple thinking applied on a grand scale, of recognizing that sometimes the best defense is just making things really, really inconvenient for your enemies. The gateway paradox, invitation and trap. Having crossed the moat, whether by lowered drawbridge or some other means, a medieval visitor would encounter the gatehouse, and here is where castle design revealed its true brilliance, or perhaps its true cruelty, depending on which side of the entrance you found yourself on. The gatehouse appeared welcoming from a distance, It was often the most decorated part of the castle, with fine stonework, carved details, banners flying from towers flanking the entrance. It looked like an invitation, a formal announcement that here, yes here, is where you enter. But this appearance was deeply deceptive. The gatehouse wasn't really an entrance at all. It was a trap, a carefully designed killing zone disguised as hospitality. Imagine you're part of an attacking force. You've made it across the moat, a considerable achievement. The drawbridge is down, the gate appears open. You rush forward with your companions, eager to press your advantage. You enter the tunnel that passes through the gatehouse, and suddenly everything changes. Behind you, a heavy portcullis, that iron grating with sharp spikes at its bottom, drops with a tremendous crash, sealing off your retreat. Ahead of you, another portcullis drops, blocking your advance. You're trapped in a stone corridor, perhaps 30 feet long, 10 feet wide. Above you in the ceiling are holes, innocent-looking openings that are called, with characteristic medieval directness, murder holes. Through these murder holes, defenders can drop almost anything. Rocks, certainly. These were plentiful and effective. Boiling water was popular, both painful and psychologically devastating. On more prosperous days, boiling oil, though this was expensive and thus reserved for special occasions or particularly irritating enemies. Even just heavy objects, dropped from 20 feet up, could be lethal. But wait, there's more. On either side of you, set into the walls at regular intervals, are arrow slits. Through these narrow openings, crossbowmen can shoot at you from complete safety. You're in a confined space, unable to dodge effectively. While they're protected by thick stone walls, it's less a fair fight and more a shooting gallery where you're the target. The genius of this design cannot be overstated. A handful of defenders could hold off a much larger attacking force indefinitely. The attackers crowded into that narrow tunnel couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. They couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, and were being systematically destroyed from above and from the sides. Many a siege ended right here, at the gatehouse, with attackers deciding that perhaps negotiation was a better option than continuing forward. Some particularly paranoid or ambitious castle builders installed multiple portcullises, creating a series of these trap chambers. You might fight your way through one killing zone only to find yourself in another identical trap. It was medieval defense in layers, each layer as effective as the last. What makes this even more remarkable is that the gatehouse also served as living quarters for the guards. Yes, the same space where boiling oil occasionally rained from the ceiling was also someone's bedroom and office. Guards stationed in the gatehouse had comfortable chambers in the upper floors, with views of the approach, and quick access to all the defensive mechanisms. They worked where they lived, which was convenient even if the workplace was occasionally violent. For friendly visitors, passing through the gatehouse was less traumatic, but still memorable. They would enter that shadowy tunnel, perhaps glancing up nervously at the murder holes, very aware that they were completely at the mercy of their hosts. It was a humbling experience, a physical reminder that entering a castle was a privilege granted by those within, not a right assumed by those without. The portcullis itself was a masterpiece of practical engineering. These massive iron gratings, some weighing several tons, could be raised or lowered surprisingly quickly. The mechanisms involved counterweights, pulleys, and often teams of men turning windlasses. When a portcullis dropped, it fell with enough force to crush whatever was beneath it. The bottom edges were spiked specifically for this purpose, to ensure that anyone caught underneath would be impaled rather than merely trapped. Modern visitors to medieval castles often pause in these gatehouses, looking up at the murder holes, examining the grooves where portcullises once slid up and down. The spaces feel different from the rest of the castle, more oppressive somehow, heavy with the memory of their purpose. These were not rooms designed for living, but for controlling access, for transforming the simple act of entering into a test of permitted versus unpermitted, friend versus foe. And so, the gatehouse stands in history as one of the cleverest architectural solutions ever devised. It was polite on the outside, murderous on the inside. It invited approach while promising destruction. It was customer service, medieval style, welcoming right up until the moment you proved unwelcome, at which point it became something else entirely. The drawbridge said, "Please, come in," while the gatehouse immediately followed with "Just kidding." It was, in its own way, perfect. Now, having somehow survived the gatehouse, let us consider what awaits deeper within the castle. And here we encounter another element that seems innocent, but was designed with warfare constantly in mind: the staircase. Medieval castle staircases were not built for comfort. They were not designed to make daily life easier. They were, quite deliberately, instruments of defense that happened to also serve the practical purpose of moving between floors. Every step, every turn, every dimension was calculated to give defenders a tremendous advantage over attackers. Most castle staircases spiral upward in a clockwise direction. To the modern visitor, this might seem arbitrary, perhaps aesthetic, but there was cold logic behind this choice, since most people are right-handed, and most soldiers fought with swords in their right hands. Climbing a clockwise spiral presented a problem for attackers. Their sword arms were pressed against the central column, the stone pillar around which the staircase wound. This limited their range of motion, made effective sword work nearly impossible. Defenders coming down the stairs, however, faced no such limitation. Their right arms had the open side of the spiral, allowing them full freedom to swing their weapons. It was a brilliant application of geometry to warfare, turning architecture into an ally. But the spiral was only part of the challenge. Medieval builders made each step slightly different in height and depth. To someone climbing quickly, especially in the heat of battle with adrenaline pumping, these irregularities were treacherous. You couldn't establish a rhythm. You couldn't charge upward without risking a stumble, and stumbling on stone steps while wearing armor, while carrying weapons, while people above you were trying to kill you. That tended to end poorly. These uneven steps served another purpose in peacetime. Servants climbing them multiple times daily developed an intimate knowledge of each stair's peculiarities. They learned exactly where to place their feet, how to navigate the spiral efficiently, even in darkness. This familiarity was invisible to visitors, who would climb more slowly, more carefully, unconsciously acknowledging their unfamiliarity with the space. The staircases also narrowed as they ascended. This meant that only one person could climb at a time, preventing attackers from rushing up in force. What good are superior numbers if you can only attack single file? Defenders at the top needed only to hold one position against one person at a time, making the defensive task almost manageable even against overwhelming odds. Some castles featured different spiral directions and different towers, just to add confusion. An attacker who had learned to fight on clockwise spirals would find themselves suddenly on a counterclockwise one, their hard-won adaptation now a liability. This wasn't accidental. Medieval builders thought about these things, planned for them, incorporated them into their designs with the same care that modern architects consider accessibility and comfort. The psychological effect of these staircases shouldn't be underestimated either. Climbing a narrow spiral in semi-darkness, knowing that at the top armed men waited, that every step took you deeper into enemy territory, that retreat would be even more difficult than advance. This was mentally exhausting. Some attackers gave up not because they were defeated, but because continuing upward seemed increasingly pointless. Of course, these same staircases made daily life in the castle rather challenging. Servants carrying food, nobles ascending to their chambers, guards making their rounds. Everyone had to navigate these spirals multiple times each day. Slips and falls were common. Carrying anything bulky was difficult. Moving furniture between floors was a nightmarish task that probably caused more than a few medieval movers to reconsider their career choices. Yet despite the daily inconvenience, the defensive advantages were undeniable. The spiral staircase represented medieval ingenuity at its finest, taking a necessary architectural feature and transforming it into a weapon. It proved that in castle design, nothing was neutral. Every element served defense first, and convenience, if it was considered at all, came a distant second. Let us move now from the staircases to the walls themselves, where another brilliant defensive feature awaited. If you've ever toured a medieval castle, you've likely noticed the narrow vertical slits in the walls. From outside they appear to be barely there, thin dark lines in the stone that seem far too small to be useful for anything. These are arrow slits, sometimes called arrow loops, and they represent medieval engineering at its most elegantly lethal. What appears as a narrow crack from the outside opens into a much wider space on the interior, creating a wedge-shaped opening that gave archers extraordinary advantage. Picture this from the defender's perspective. You stand in a room behind one of these slits. The opening on your side is perhaps 3 feet wide, giving you plenty of room to move, to adjust your position, to aim your bow or crossbow. You can see out clearly, observing the approach of enemies. But from outside, you're nearly invisible. The narrow opening makes you almost impossible to target. Now picture it from the attacker's perspective. You're outside the castle, trying to shoot at defenders you know are inside but can barely see. You might lose 100 arrows at that wall, and 99% of them will simply strike stone and fall harmlessly away. Meanwhile, the defender behind that slit can take careful aim and shoot with relative impunity. It was asymmetric warfare conducted through architecture. One archer, safely positioned behind an arrow slit, could hold off a much larger force. The defenders didn't need superior numbers. They needed superior position, and the arrow slit provided exactly that. As military technology evolved, so did the arrow slits. Simple vertical cuts gave way to more complex shapes. Cross-shaped openings appeared, designed for crossbows, which fired horizontally and needed different angles of aim. Circular openings were added for early firearms. Some castles featured angled slits that covered specific approach routes, ensuring that attackers couldn't find any blind spots. Medieval architects were, in essence, designing three-dimensional fields of fire long before that term existed. They calculated sight lines, overlapping coverage, zones where multiple archers could target the same space. It was sophisticated military planning executed in stone. Of course, these narrow windows came with significant drawbacks for the castle's inhabitants. Sunlight barely penetrated these slits. The interior of medieval castles was perpetually dim, requiring candles and torches even during the day. This darkness contributed to the cold, damp atmosphere that characterized castle life. Rooms were shadowy places where you might bump into furniture or other people long before you saw them clearly. Rain also found its way through arrow slits, adding to the general dampness. Wind whistled through them, creating drafts that made maintaining warmth even more difficult. In winter, these slits became channels for cold air to invade the interior, turning rooms into spaces that were only marginally warmer than the outside. Yet despite these discomforts, the arrow slit remained a standard feature of castle design for centuries. Its defensive value outweighed every inconvenience. Some castles even incorporated false arrow slits, carved into the walls, but not actually opening into interior spaces, simply to make the fortress appear more heavily defended than it actually was. It was psychological warfare through architecture, suggesting that more archers lurked within than might actually be the case. The arrow slit embodied the fundamental philosophy of medieval defense: safety through visibility. Defenders needed to see out, but attackers needed not to see in. It was a simple principle executed with geometric precision, creating spaces that were nearly perfect for their intended purpose, even if they made daily living considerably less pleasant. Deep within every great castle, protected by all these layers of defense, stood the keep. This was the fortress within the fortress, the last refuge, the final fallback position when everything else had failed. The keep was both home and bunker, palace and prison, combining residential comfort such as it was with military necessity. Architecturally, the keep was usually the tallest structure in the castle, a massive stone tower that dominated the skyline. This wasn't merely for aesthetic reasons, though the psychological impact of a towering keep was considerable. Height provided visibility, allowing defenders to watch not just their immediate surroundings but the distant landscape as well. From the top of a keep, you could see armies approaching days before they arrived, smoke from distant fires, ships on the horizon if your castle was near the coast. The walls of the keep were extraordinarily thick, sometimes 10 or 12 feet of solid stone. This provided protection against siege weapons and also helped with temperature regulation, though helped might be too strong a word. The massive walls prevented the interior from getting extremely hot or extremely cold, instead maintaining a constant cool dampness that characterized medieval stone buildings. Inside, the keep was divided into multiple floors, each serving different purposes. The lowest level, sometimes below ground, served as storage and occasionally as a dungeon. Here, in darkness and dampness, supplies were kept and prisoners held. The next floors might contain armories, guard rooms, and servants' quarters. Higher up were the residential floors where the lord and his family lived, and at the very top, the solar or great chamber, the most private and prestigious space in the entire castle. Despite being the most protected and important part of the castle, the keep was not particularly comfortable. Thick walls meant small windows, which meant limited light. Heating was challenging. Fireplaces could warm the immediate area but had little effect on rooms as a whole. Smoke was a constant companion, as chimneys, when they existed, were often poorly designed, allowing smoke to linger or even be pushed back into rooms by wind. Privacy was minimal. In most keeps, rooms flowed into one another without hallways. To reach your chamber, you might have to walk through 3 other rooms, each occupied by servants, guards, or guests. The concept of personal space as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Life in a keep meant constant proximity to others, constant awareness of being watched and heard. Yet for all its discomforts, the keep served its purpose brilliantly. During a siege, when outer walls had fallen and the bailey was overrun, the keep became the last stand. Its thick walls could withstand bombardment that would crumble lighter structures. Its height made direct assault nearly impossible. Supplies stored in its lower levels could sustain defenders for weeks or even months. The keep represented ultimate security purchased at the cost of daily comfort. It was survival elevated to architecture, a monument to the medieval understanding that sometimes staying alive meant accepting conditions that were merely tolerable rather than pleasant. In times of peace, the keep was cold and dark and confining. In times of war, it was salvation itself. At the summit of many keeps sat the Lord's Tower, his personal domain from which he could survey everything he controlled. This wasn't merely a bedroom or office. It was a statement of authority made physical. From this elevated position, the Lord could literally look down upon everyone else, a spatial arrangement that reinforced social hierarchy without a single word being spoken. Servants, working in the floors below, were constantly aware that their Lord resided above them. Guards on the walls knew that eyes from the tower might be watching their vigilance. Visitors understood immediately upon seeing the tower that they were entering a realm where one man's will, expressed from that elevated chamber, governed everything and everyone within sight. The keep also contained practical necessities that the outer castle might lack. Wells were often dug directly within the keep, ensuring a water supply even if the outer defenses fell. Kitchens, though they made the interior smoky, allowed food preparation to continue during siege. Chapels provided space for prayer and spiritual comfort during times of stress. The keep was designed to be self-sufficient, a small castle within the larger one. Trapdoors occasionally connected floors, allowing defenders to move between levels quickly, or to drop unpleasant surprises on enemies who somehow breached lower floors. These hidden passages and vertical shortcuts gave defenders another advantage, allowing them to appear suddenly where they were unexpected, or to escape from positions that became untenable. Yet for all its military purpose, the keep was still home. Children played in its chambers, families gathered in its halls, everyday life unfolded within its stone embrace. This dual nature, fortress and residence, gave the keep a character unlike any other form of architecture. It was where vulnerability and strength met, where the need for safety shaped every element of domestic life. Beyond the keep, encircling everything, rose the curtain walls. These were the outer defenses, the first and often most impressive barrier that greeted anyone approaching the castle. The name curtain wall sounds almost gentle, perhaps suggesting fabric hanging decoratively. But there was nothing gentle about these massive stone barriers that could rise 50 feet or more into the sky. A good curtain wall wasn't simply tall, it was thick. 10 feet of solid stone was common, with some portions even thicker. This mass served multiple purposes. It absorbed the impact of siege weapons, distributing the force of projectiles across such volume that individual hits rarely caused significant damage. It prevented tunneling, as digging through that much stone was nearly impossible. And it communicated, in the most physical way possible, that getting inside would require more than casual effort. Many castles featured not one but multiple curtain walls, creating concentric rings of defense. If attackers somehow breached the outer wall, they found themselves in a courtyard surrounded by the second wall, trapped in what defenders cheerfully called the killing zone. This space between walls was designed for exactly what its name suggested. Archers on the inner wall could rain arrows down on anyone caught between the barriers. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. The walls themselves were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Their tops were crenellated, featuring regular gaps called crenelles alternating with solid sections called merlons. This gave defenders cover while allowing them to shoot between the openings. Walking along the wall's top, guards could patrol safely, protected by the merlons, while maintaining clear views through the crenelles. At regular intervals, towers broke the line of the curtain wall. These served multiple purposes. They provided elevated positions for better visibility. They broke up the wall into sections that could be defended independently. And, crucially, they eliminated blind spots. Medieval engineers carefully calculated the distance between towers to ensure that archers in each tower could cover the wall sections on either side, creating overlapping fields of fire where no attacker could approach unseen. The bases of curtain walls were often sloped or battered, angling outward toward the ground. This seemingly simple modification had brilliant effects. It made siege towers less effective, as they couldn't easily be positioned against the wall. It caused projectiles to deflect rather than hit straight on. And it made climbing or laddering the wall more difficult, as the angle forced attackers to lean outward while climbing, an exhausting and precarious position. Building these walls was an enormous undertaking. The quarrying of stone, its transport, the construction of scaffolding, the actual placement of each block, all of these required years of sustained effort. Entire generations of workers devoted their lives to a single wall. Some men began as apprentices and died of old age without ever seeing the project completed. The expense was staggering. A lord might bankrupt his estate building curtain walls, taxing his subjects to the point of resentment, borrowing money he'd never fully repay. Yet once built, the walls stood as testimony to that investment. They said to the world, "This lord commanded enough resources to build this." Imagine what else he might be capable of. Maintenance was an ongoing challenge. Stones cracked and needed replacement. Mortar wore away and required repair. Weather, that patient enemy of all human construction, worked constantly to reclaim the walls back into rubble. Teams of masons were employed year-round just keeping the fortifications in working order. Despite all this effort and expense, curtain walls worked. They transformed vulnerable settlements into fortresses that could resist armies. They bought time during sieges, forcing attackers to settle in for long campaigns rather than quick assaults. And they served as the ultimate expression of medieval military thinking: defense through depth, through layers, through making every step forward costly for the enemy. The art of destruction, siege warfare, evolves. While castles grew ever more sophisticated in their defenses, those seeking to conquer them developed increasingly clever methods of attack. This arms race between fortress and siegecraft drove innovation on both sides, turning warfare into an odd sort of competitive engineering challenge. Early siege tactics were straightforward and usually unsuccessful. Attackers would throw themselves at walls with ladders, hoping that determination and numbers would overcome stone and height. This rarely worked well. Ladders could be pushed away from walls. Attackers could be picked off one by one as they climbed, and the entire endeavor usually ended with more casualties than progress. Then came the siege engines, and warfare changed dramatically. The trebuchet represented medieval engineering at its most impressive and most destructive. Using counterweights and long lever arms, these machines could hurl enormous stones with remarkable accuracy over considerable distances. A well-placed boulder could damage battlements, smash through roofs, or simply terrorize defenders by demonstrating that nowhere within the castle was entirely safe. Building and operating trebuchets required significant expertise. Engineers calculated trajectories, adjusted counterweights, and fine-tuned mechanisms until the machine could consistently hit specific targets. It was mathematics applied to destruction, proving that medieval scholars were perfectly capable of complex calculations when the results were sufficiently violent. The battering ram was less sophisticated, but no less effective. A large log, often tipped with iron and suspended from a wheeled frame, could be swung repeatedly against gates or walls until something gave way. The rhythmic pounding was both physically destructive and psychologically wearing. Defenders listening to that steady thud, 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 knowing that with each impact their defenses weakened, found the sound almost maddening. Defenders, of course, developed countermeasures. Boiling water was effective and economical, though it required significant fuel to heat. Hot sand was even more terrible, as it could get inside armor and continue burning long after initial contact. Oil was expensive but devastatingly effective. Some defenders simply dropped heavy stones, letting gravity do the work. Some castles featured hoardings, wooden galleries that projected out from the wall tops, allowing defenders to drop things directly onto attackers at the wall's base. These structures were vulnerable to fire, so they were often added only during actual sieges, but they proved quite effective when properly employed. Mining, or tunneling under walls, became an art form. Attackers would dig tunnels beneath the foundations, shore them up with wooden supports, then set fire to those supports. When the wood burned away, the tunnel collapsed, hopefully bringing down the wall above it. Defenders responded by digging countermines, trying to intercept the attackers' tunnels, leading to underground battles in darkness that must have been absolutely terrifying. Yet for all this military innovation, many sieges were won not by superior tactics but by simple patience. Starvation was often more effective than any siege engine. An army could surround a castle, cut off all supply routes, and simply wait. Months might pass. Defenders would ration food, slaughter horses for meat, eventually face the grim reality that surrender or starvation were the only options remaining. These extended sieges were tests of will as much as military strength. Attackers had to maintain their own supply lines, keep soldiers motivated during long, boring months, and hope that no relieving army arrived to trap them between castle and reinforcements. It was expensive, time-consuming, and often ended in negotiated surrender rather than dramatic conquest. The evolution of siege warfare demonstrated something important about medieval military thinking. Success came not from brilliant tactics or superior courage, but from systematic thinking, careful planning, and the willingness to invest time and resources into gradually overcoming obstacles. It was warfare as patient attrition, as much about logistics and engineering as about swords and arrows. Life behind stone, the daily reality. Now let us step back from warfare and consider what life was actually like within these magnificent fortresses. Because for every day spent defending against enemies, there were hundreds spent simply living, going about the mundane tasks that fill any household, just in circumstances that were considerably less comfortable than one might imagine. From the outside, a castle appeared majestic, powerful, enviable. Inside, it was essentially a cold, damp, smoky cave that happened to be very good at not falling down. The same thick stone walls that stopped arrows and catapult stones also trapped moisture, blocked sunlight, and made heating nearly impossible. The great hall, centerpiece of castle life, was where much of daily existence unfolded. This was dining room, courtroom, meeting space, and occasionally bedroom for lesser servants who slept on the floor after everyone else retired. It was perpetually busy, perpetually loud, and perpetually cold, despite the enormous fireplace that blazed at one end. That fireplace deserves particular attention. It was often large enough to walk into, capable of burning whole logs as thick as a man's torso. It roared with flames and consumed fuel at an astonishing rate. And yet, its heat barely extended 10 feet into the room. Stand close to the fire and you might feel warm, almost hot. Move just a short distance away, and you might as well be outside. The problem was simple physics. Those massive stone walls absorbed heat faster than any fire could provide it. Smoke was everywhere. Chimneys existed but were often inadequate, and on windy days might actually blow smoke back into the room. The smell of wood smoke permeated everything: clothing, hair, furnishings. People living in castles simply accepted that they would smell of smoke constantly. It was the scent of indoor life. Windows, as we've discussed, were narrow slits designed for archery. This meant interiors were dim, even on bright sunny days. Candles and torches provided supplemental light, but these were expensive. Only the wealthiest lords could afford to truly illuminate their halls. Most castle dwellers lived in semi-darkness, their eyes adjusted to gloom, their world one of shadows and flickering flames. The floor of the great hall was typically covered with rushes, dried grass or reeds strewn about to absorb spills and provide some minimal insulation from the cold stone beneath. These rushes were periodically replaced, but the definition of periodically was rather generous. They accumulated food scraps, spilled drinks, and various other materials best left unspecified. The smell could be remarkable, particularly in summer. Dogs wandered freely through the hall. In medieval times, hunting dogs were common in noble households, and they went wherever they pleased. They slept near the fire, begged at the table, and added their own contributions to the rushes on the floor. Some nobles loved their dogs more than their servants, which led to interesting household dynamics. Meals were elaborate affairs, at least for the nobles. Multiple courses, exotic ingredients, when available, careful presentation. But the food, no matter how carefully prepared in the kitchen, arrived at the table somewhat cooled by the journey through drafty corridors, and no matter what was served, it was consumed in a cold room filled with smoke, surrounded by dogs and a crowd of retainers who watched every bite. The kitchen itself was usually in a separate building or at least a separate part of the castle, kept distant due to fire risk. This meant that preparing a hot meal and delivering it hot to the great hall was nearly impossible. Medieval diners simply accepted that their food would be lukewarm at best, a small price to pay for not having the entire castle burned down because a kitchen fire got out of control. Sanitation was primitive. The garderobe, which sounds rather elegant, was essentially a small closet with a hole in the floor. This hole opened to the outside of the castle, usually emptying down the wall or into the moat. It was functional, certainly, but hardly pleasant. In winter, sitting on a stone seat in an unheated closet, with cold wind blowing up through the hole below you, were an experience that encouraged brevity. Some garderobes were built into the thickness of the walls, accessible from chambers. Others were external, small wooden boxes projecting from the wall face. These were particularly unpleasant in rain or snow. The medieval toilet was not a place for contemplation or relaxation. It was a necessary evil to be endured as quickly as possible. Bathing was infrequent, partly due to the difficulty of heating enough water, and partly due to medieval medical theories that suggested bathing might be unhealthy. When nobles did bathe, it was an elaborate process involving wooden tubs, multiple servants to carry heated water, and often herbs or flowers added to make the experience more pleasant. For common folk within the castle, bathing meant occasionally using a basin of cold water, or, if fortunate, visiting a nearby stream in summer. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Nobles might have their own chambers, but servants slept in groups in shared spaces. Even within private chambers, servants came and went constantly. The idea of being truly alone was foreign to medieval life. You were always within earshot of others, always visible to someone. Despite all these discomforts, castle life had its rhythms and routines that provided structure and even comfort of a sort. The daily round of prayers, meals, work, and sleep created predictability. Feast days broke the monotony with celebration. The change of seasons brought different tasks and different challenges, marking time's passage, and for all its hardships, the castle provided safety. In a world where violence was common and life precarious, those stone walls meant security. You might be cold, you might be uncomfortable, but you were alive and protected. For medieval people, that trade-off was absolutely worth it. The castle was home, even if home was drafty, smoky, and considerably less romantic than later centuries would imagine. Symbols of power, the castle's social message. We should pause here and consider what castles meant beyond their practical military and residential functions. Because these structures were never merely buildings, they were statements, arguments made in stone, visible declarations of power and authority that every person in the surrounding countryside saw and understood. A castle on the horizon communicated complex messages without words. To peasants working in fields below, it was a constant reminder of their place in the social order. The Lord lived high above them, literally elevated, surrounded by stone that announced his resources and connections. They lived in wooden houses that a simple fire could destroy. He lived in stone that would outlast generations. This wasn't accidental. The feudal system depended on clear, visible hierarchy. Everyone needed to know their place, and architecture reinforced that knowledge daily. The peasant looked up at the castle each morning and was reminded, someone more powerful lives there, someone who can protect you, but also someone who must be obeyed. For the Lord himself, the castle was both security and prison. Yes, he was safe within those walls, but he was also isolated, separated from his subjects by design and necessity. He couldn't simply walk among the common people without risk. He lived apart, elevated, surrounded by walls both physical and social. The castle also served surveillance functions. From its towers, guards could observe the surrounding landscape constantly. Roads were watched, strangers noted. Unusual activities reported. The castle was like a stone sentinel, never sleeping, always aware. This created a subtle pressure on the local population, a sense of being observed that encouraged compliance and discouraged rebellion. When neighboring lords visited, they read the castle like a document. The height of the walls, the number of towers, the quality of the stonework, all of these communicated the host's wealth and power. A well-maintained castle announced prosperity and control. A crumbling one suggested decline and vulnerability. In this way, castles were part of a non-verbal conversation between nobility, each trying to impress or intimidate the others. The chapel within the castle grounds served multiple purposes. Yes, it provided space for worship, fulfilling spiritual needs. But it also demonstrated piety, suggesting that the Lord's authority came with divine approval. The proximity of sacred and secular spaces reinforced the idea that earthly power reflected heavenly order. Markets and fairs held near castles benefited from their protection, but also acknowledged their authority. Merchants paid fees for the privilege of trading under the castle's shadow. These economic relationships further embedded the castle into the social fabric, making it central to both military defense and economic life. As we move forward through time, we witness a fascinating transformation in the nature of these stone fortresses. By the late Middle Ages, something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between castle and warfare. The arrival of gunpowder changed everything, as quietly and surely as dawn changes night into day. For centuries, stone walls had been the ultimate answer to military threats. Thick enough, high enough, and properly designed, they could resist almost any assault. Armies might batter at them for months without success. But then came cannons, and those patient, enduring walls suddenly seemed fragile. The first cannons were crude, dangerous to their operators, and not particularly accurate. But they improved, as technology always does. Within a few generations, artillery had developed to the point where it could reliably breach walls that had stood unchallenged for centuries. What once required months of siege could now be accomplished in days, or even hours, with sufficient firepower. Castle builders tried to adapt. They lowered walls, making them less prominent targets. They thickened them further, trying to absorb the impact of cannonballs. They built earthen ramparts that could absorb artillery fire better than stone. Some of these adaptations worked, for a time, but the fundamental equation had changed. The age of the impregnable stone fortress was ending. As castles became less militarily relevant, they began to transform into something new. If you couldn't make your residence truly defensible anymore, you might as well make it comfortable. And so began the evolution from fortress to palace, from military stronghold to luxurious home that merely looked like a fortress. Windows grew larger, allowing actual sunlight into interior spaces. Walls became thinner, making room for more chambers and reducing construction costs. Moats, when they remained at all, were transformed into decorative water features, sometimes with swans floating peacefully where once armed men had patrolled. Arrow slits were widened into proper windows, or closed entirely in favor of solid, warm walls. The great halls that had been cold, smoky gathering spaces became more refined. Tapestries covered the stone walls, providing insulation and beauty. Carpets replaced the rush-strewn floors. Furniture became more elaborate, designed for comfort rather than mere utility. The fireplace remained, but now it was complemented by better-designed chimneys that actually removed smoke effectively. Defensive towers became residential towers, their upper chambers transformed into pleasant rooms with views of the surrounding countryside. What had been watch posts became bedrooms, studies, private spaces where nobles could retreat from the constant crowd of castle life. The transformation was thorough, and sometimes quite beautiful. Some lords couldn't entirely let go of the martial aesthetic. They built decorative battlements that served no defensive purpose but looked impressive. They kept arrow slits, even though no archers would ever use them. These fake fortifications were architecture's equivalent of a theatrical prop, suggesting strength that no longer existed but maintaining the appearance of traditional power. Gardens appeared within castle grounds, elaborate formal arrangements that would have been dangerous liabilities during siege warfare, but were perfect for leisurely walks in peacetime. Fountains replaced guard posts. Orchards grew where troops once drilled. The castle grounds became parkland, showcasing the owner's taste and wealth rather than his military readiness. The Renaissance brought additional changes as Italian architectural ideas spread northward. Symmetry became important. Classical proportions replaced medieval practicality. Castles built or renovated during this period sometimes struggled with the tension between looking like a fortress and embracing the new aesthetic ideals of beauty and mathematical harmony. Inside, comfort increased dramatically. Private chambers became more common, allowing family members actual privacy for the first time in castle history. Heating improved with better fireplace design, and sometimes with early central heating systems that circulated warm air through passages in the walls. Glass windows, once a luxury beyond imagining, became standard in wealthy households. The kitchens, no longer separated for fear of fire now that construction techniques had improved, moved closer to dining areas. Food arrived hot, a revolutionary change. Plumbing, though still primitive by modern standards, improved. Some castles acquired indoor water sources beyond simple wells, with pipes carrying water to various locations. This transition from fortress to palace was not universal or instant. Some castles remained purely military structures, maintained by governments rather than private lords. Others were abandoned entirely, left to slowly crumble as their owners moved to more comfortable residences. But for those that survived, the transformation represented a fundamental shift in priorities from survival to style, from defense to display. The irony is rich. These structures that had been built at enormous cost to resist destruction were voluntarily altered, made vulnerable, in the pursuit of comfort. The message they sent changed from "you cannot conquer me to look how refined I am." It was architecture following society's evolution from medieval warfare to early modern diplomacy, from martial necessity to cultural sophistication. And yet, despite these transformations, despite becoming obsolete militarily and changing into something quite different from their original purpose, castles endured. They stand still, scattered across the European landscape and beyond, silent witnesses to centuries of human ambition, fear, and ingenuity. There is something profound about standing inside a medieval castle today. The weight of time presses down on you in a way that few other structures achieve. These stones were placed by hands long turned to dust. The walls heard conversations in languages that have evolved beyond recognition. Countless lives unfolded within these spaces, each person believing their concerns were paramount, their era unique, their troubles unprecedented. The castle reminds us of impermanence even while demonstrating endurance. Yes, the walls still stand, but the people who built them, who lived in them, who fought for and about them, all of those are gone. What remains is the container, not the contents. The stage survives while the players have long since departed. Modern visitors walk through these spaces with cameras and guidebooks, taking selfies in front of ancient fireplaces, posing beneath arrow slits. The castles have become tourist attractions, educational sites, venues for weddings and events. They serve purposes their builders never imagined, hosting Renaissance fairs and historical reenactments, providing backdrops for films and photographs. In this new role, castles have found perhaps their final purpose, as portals to imagination. They allow us to connect, however imperfectly, with a past that was simultaneously more brutal and more human than we often imagine. Standing in a great hall, even one restored and maintained for visitors, we can sense the lives that passed through this space, the arguments and celebrations, the fear and joy, the mundane and the momentous. All of it happened here. Architectural historians study castles to understand medieval building techniques, military strategy, social organization. They measure walls, examine stones, trace the evolution of design over centuries. This academic work preserves knowledge and provides context. But there is something beyond the academic that castles offer. They represent humanity's eternal struggle with time and mortality. Every lord who built a castle was, in some sense, attempting to achieve immortality. "I will build something that outlasts me," they said through stone and labor. "I will leave a mark on the landscape that future generations cannot ignore." And in this they succeeded, though perhaps not in the way they intended. The castle builders wanted to be remembered as powerful, as wise, as worthy of respect. What they actually left behind is evidence of anxiety and ambition intertwined. These massive fortifications speak of fear as much as strength, of uncertainty disguised as confidence. They are monuments to the very human desire for safety in a dangerous world. Some castles have been maintained continuously for centuries, their owners changing but their purpose remaining somewhat constant. These are living buildings, adapted to each era's needs while retaining their essential character. Others became ruins, picturesque fragments that inspired romantic poets and painters. These ruins, in their own way, tell stories just as eloquent as their intact cousins. The crumbling castle, overtaken by ivy and worn by weather, reminds us that no human creation is permanent. The stones may last for centuries, but eventually they will return to the earth from which they came. Nature is patient, and time is on its side. The castle's message shifts from "I am strong" to "all strength eventually yields." Yet even in ruin, there is beauty and meaning. The way light falls through a collapsed roof onto a floor covered in grass and wildflowers can be breathtaking. Birds nest in towers that once housed soldiers. Trees grow from cracks in walls that were built to resist battering rams. Nature reclaims its space, gently but inevitably, transforming human ambition into something organic and wild. In the modern world, we still build fortresses, though we call them by different names and construct them from different materials. Corporate headquarters with their security systems and controlled access, gated communities with their walls and guards, secure government facilities with their layers of defense. All of these echo the castle's logic. We still seek safety behind barriers. We still use architecture to announce power and wealth. The impulse that built the first Motte and Bailey hasn't disappeared, it's merely evolved. Now, let us turn our attention to something quite different. We leave behind the cold stone corridors of medieval Europe and travel both south and backward in time, to another world where stone buildings served very different purposes, where power was displayed not through fortification but through spectacle, and where architecture framed not warfare but something more complex and ambiguous. We find ourselves in ancient Rome, that vast empire that dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries. Here, power was certainly enforced through military might, but it was also performed, displayed, and negotiated through social rituals. And no ritual was more important, more laden with meaning than the feast. When modern people hear the phrase Roman orgy, their minds often leap to images of unrestrained hedonism, of moral chaos and decadent abandon. This image, vivid and persistent, owes more to later imaginings than to historical reality. It's worth examining where these ideas came from and what Roman feasting actually looked like. The Roman convivium, or banquet, was indeed a place of pleasure and indulgence. But it was also, perhaps primarily, a venue for politics and social maneuvering. These were not wild parties where control was lost, but rather carefully orchestrated events where every detail communicated something about the host's status, taste, and power. To understand Roman feasting, we must first understand that for Roman elites, almost nothing was purely private or purely social. Everything had political implications. A dinner invitation was never just a meal. It was an opportunity to forge alliances, demonstrate loyalty, gather information, or subtly threaten rivals. The dining room was a battlefield where conflicts were waged with wine and words rather than swords. The sources we have for Roman banquets are problematic. They come largely from historians writing during or after the empire's decline, often with moral or political agendas. Writers like Suetonius and Tacitus describe the feasts of emperors they despised, and their descriptions should be read with skepticism. These were not neutral observers documenting events. They were partisan commentators using scandal to make arguments about governance and virtue. When Suetonius writes about Caligula's feasts or Tacitus describes Nero's excesses, we must ask, were these accurate accounts, or were they character assassinations disguised as history? The answer is probably somewhere in between. Some elements were likely true, others exaggerated, and some possibly invented entirely. Political enemies used accusations of excessive feasting, the way modern politicians use scandal, as weapons to damage reputations. The Christian writers who came later had their own reasons for emphasizing Roman debauchery. They needed to contrast pagan corruption with Christian virtue to explain Rome's fall as divine punishment for moral failure. These writers took the already exaggerated accounts and amplified them further, creating a vision of Roman banquets that was more theological metaphor than historical description. So, what were Roman feasts actually like? Archaeological evidence suggests something more restrained than legend claims. Dining rooms discovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum show spaces designed for small groups, perhaps a dozen guests, reclining on couches arranged in a U-shape around a central space. There were musicians and entertainers, yes, and the food was elaborate. But the overall impression is of sophistication rather than chaos, of refinement rather than abandon. The wealthy Roman host sought to impress through the quality and variety of his offerings. Exotic ingredients from distant provinces, creative preparations, beautiful presentation, these demonstrated wealth and connections. A successful feast showcased the host's resources while maintaining an atmosphere of cultured conversation and controlled pleasure. The word orgy itself has been misunderstood. In Greek, orgia referred to religious rites, often associated with mystery cults. These were sacred ceremonies, not drunken parties. When early Christian writers adopted the term and applied it to Roman feasting, they twisted its meaning, turning religious ritual into vice. By the Middle Ages, orgy had become shorthand for any kind of excessive behavior, completely detached from its original meaning. The reality of Roman banquets, then, was complex. They were places of genuine pleasure and indulgence, yes, but pleasure that served social and political purposes. They were performances where participants played roles, where every gesture was observed and interpreted, where reputation could be made or destroyed over the course of an evening. As we settle into this new setting, surrounded not by stone walls but by marble columns and painted frescoes, we find ourselves in a different kind of power structure. The castle said, "I can defend myself." The Roman banquet said, "I can afford to be generous, and you should be grateful." Both were monuments to power, just expressed through very different means. Picture, if you will, a Roman triclinium, the dining room where these elaborate social rituals unfolded. The name itself tells us something important. It comes from the Greek for 3 couches, describing the typical arrangement. 3 large couches, each accommodating 3 or 4 guests, were arranged in a U-shape around a central open space. This created an intimate setting where everyone could see and be seen, where no conversation could be truly private. The couches themselves were works of art. Wealthy Romans reclined on cushions of silk or fine wool, embroidered with intricate patterns. The frames might be wood inlaid with ivory or bronze, sometimes even silver. Simply sitting down, or rather reclining down, was a statement about the host's resources. Comfort here was expensive, and that expense was intentional. Reclining to eat, which seems unusual to modern sensibilities, was actually quite deliberate. It was the Greek and Roman way of distinguishing civilized dining from barbaric eating. Reclining suggested leisure, culture, and freedom from labor. It said, without words, I am important enough that I need not sit upright like a common worker. I can lounge, at ease, while others serve me. The placement of guests followed strict protocol. The most honored position was to the host's right, the second most honored to his left. Distances from the host indicated social standing with geometric precision. A guest's couch placement told everyone present where they stood in the social hierarchy. This wasn't casual socializing, it was a public display of relationships and status. Slaves moved through the space constantly, bringing dishes, pouring wine, removing empty plates. These servants were trained to be invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to serve without seeming to exist as individuals. Their choreographed movements added to the overall effect of smooth, effortless luxury, as if food and wine appeared through magic rather than labor. The meal itself unfolded in courses, each more elaborate than the last. It typically began with the gustaccio, appetizers that stimulated the appetite. These might include eggs, vegetables, small fish, or oysters, those beloved Roman delicacies that were transported alive from coastal waters to urban dining rooms through impressive feats of logistics. Then came the prima mensa, the main course, often featuring multiple dishes. Roasted meats, game birds, fish prepared in various ways, all presented with artistic care. The Romans loved elaborate sauces, particularly garum, a fermented fish sauce that appeared in nearly everything. Modern palates might find some of these flavors overwhelming, but to Roman taste, properly seasoned food demonstrated culinary sophistication. Finally, the secunda mensa, dessert and fruits, provided a sweet conclusion. Fresh fruits when available, preserved fruits when not, sweetmeats, nuts, and pastries demonstrated the host's access to luxury items. Sugar was unknown in classical Rome, so honey provided sweetness, another costly ingredient that separated rich tables from poor. Throughout the meal, wine flowed constantly, but Roman wine was not consumed as we might drink it today. It was typically mixed with water, often at a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a mark of someone who couldn't control their appetites. The proper Roman showed moderation in consumption, even while indulging in elaborate meals. Conversation was as important as food. These dinners were opportunities for philosophical discussion, for political debate, for the exchange of news and gossip. A successful host facilitated interesting conversation, perhaps by inviting poets to recite new work or philosophers to present ideas. The intellectual quality of a feast mattered as much as the physical quality. Entertainment might include musicians playing lyres or flutes, creating a pleasant background to conversation. Dancers might perform between courses. In very lavish feasts, more elaborate entertainment appeared. Acrobats, actors performing scenes from plays, even exotic animals displayed for guests' amazement. But these spectacles were more common in imperial feasts than in typical aristocratic dinners. The lighting itself was part of the performance. Oil lamps, dozens of them in wealthy households, created a warm, flickering ambiance. The play of light and shadow across the room added drama to the event. Expensive lamps, beautifully crafted from bronze or even silver, were displayed as art objects that also happened to provide illumination. Perfumes and incense filled the air, masking less pleasant smells and adding to the sensory experience. Romans loved strong scents, and a proper feast engaged all the senses, taste and smell obviously, but also sight through visual presentation, hearing through music and conversation, and even touch through the textures of fine fabrics and carefully polished serving vessels. The entire experience was designed to be overwhelming in the best possible way. A guest should leave feeling that they had experienced something extraordinary, something that demonstrated their host's power, wealth, and sophistication. The feast was a gift, but it was also a display of dominance, a reminder that the host commanded resources that most could only imagine. Here is where Roman culture becomes particularly interesting and somewhat contradictory. The same society that celebrated these elaborate feasts also praised the virtue of temperantia, moderation or self-control. Romans idealized the simple farmer-soldier who ate plain food and lived simply. Yet they also competed to host the most impressive dinners, to serve the most exotic dishes, to demonstrate the greatest luxury. This tension ran through Roman culture like a fault line. The traditional Roman values, the mos maiorum or way of the ancestors, emphasized frugality, discipline, and service to the state. The reality of imperial Rome, wealthy beyond anything earlier Romans could have imagined, encouraged consumption, display, and personal indulgence. Romans were constantly negotiating between these two poles. Moralists and philosophers regularly condemned excessive dining. Seneca wrote essays criticizing lavish feasts. Pliny praised simple meals. Cato, centuries earlier, had warned that luxury would destroy Roman virtue. These criticisms were taken seriously, at least in theory. Romans wanted to believe they were still the hardy, simple people who had built the Republic even as they reclined on silk cushions eating flamingo tongues. The result was a culture of conspicuous consumption, accompanied by constant guilt and justification. A wealthy Roman might host an elaborate feast, but feel compelled to apologize for it, to explain that he was merely fulfilling social obligations, not indulging personal appetites. The feast was for his guests' benefit, for maintaining important relationships, not for his own pleasure. This self-deception allowed Romans to have their peacock and eat it too, so to speak. Some emperors navigated this tension better than others. Augustus, the first emperor, maintained a reputation for relatively simple tastes, even while living in imperial splendor. He understood that appearing too luxurious might alienate the Roman people, who still valued traditional virtues. His public persona emphasized duty and moderation, even if his private life was comfortable. Other emperors, particularly the notorious ones whose names have come down through history as synonyms for excess, either ignored this tension or actively reveled in their own indulgence. These are the figures whose feasts became legendary, whose names became associated with debauchery. But we must remember that most of what we know about their excesses comes from hostile sources with political motives. Take Caligula, for instance. The historical accounts describe him as mad, cruel, and extravagantly wasteful. His feasts were reportedly scenes of chaos and cruelty. But Caligula had many political enemies, and the accounts were written after his assassination by people who benefited from portraying him as a monster. How much was true? How much was exaggeration or invention? We cannot know with certainty. What we can say is that Caligula understood the power of spectacle. His feasts were performances designed to demonstrate absolute power. By breaking social conventions, by doing things that shocked the Roman elite, he was asserting that he stood above traditional rules. His excesses, whether real or exaggerated, were political statements as much as personal indulgences. Nero presents a similar case. Famous for his artistic pretensions and his love of performance, Nero's feasts were theatrical events. He would sometimes perform himself, singing or playing the lyre, expecting applause and adoration. For a Roman emperor to perform like a common entertainer was deeply shocking to traditional aristocrats. Nero's feasts became symbols of his break with convention, his rejection of traditional imperial dignity. But again, most of what we know comes from sources hostile to Nero, written after his fall from power. The famous story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, for instance, is almost certainly false. He wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, and fiddles didn't exist in ancient Rome. Yet the story persists because it captures something people wanted to believe about Nero, that he was so lost in artistic self-indulgence that he neglected his duties as emperor. The truth about Roman feasting, then, lies somewhere between the moralist's condemnations and the scandalmonger's exaggerations. Yes, wealthy Romans indulged in elaborate meals. Yes, there was competition to display wealth and sophistication. Yes, excess occurred, sometimes spectacularly. But most feasts were not orgies of chaos. They were carefully managed social events where reputation and relationships were negotiated over wine and elaborate cuisine. The Roman feast was theater, politics, and genuine pleasure all mixed together. It was a space where the tension between traditional values and imperial wealth played out in real time. Guests reclined on expensive couches, ate exotic foods, and all the while pretended, or perhaps hoped, that they were still virtuous Romans of the old school, just temporarily enjoying the fruits of empire. Among the emperors whose names became synonymous with extravagant feasting, few are more colorful than Elagabalus. This young emperor, who came to power at age 14, brought with him religious practices and cultural attitudes that shocked traditional Romans to their core. Elagabalus was a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabalus before becoming emperor, and he never truly separated his religious role from his political one. To him, elaborate feasting was a form of worship, a way of honoring the divine through earthly pleasures. This theological justification for luxury was completely foreign to traditional Roman thinking. The accounts of his banquets, written by hostile historians after his death, describe almost unbelievable extravagance. Supposedly, guests would recline while rose petals fell from the ceiling in such quantities that some suffocated beneath the fragrant deluge. This story is almost certainly exaggerated, if not entirely invented, but it captures something about how Elagabalus was perceived, as someone for whom no indulgence was too extreme, no display too excessive. His menu choices became legendary. Where wealthy Romans might serve peacock or ostrich as exotic delicacies, Elagabalus supposedly served camel heels, ostrich brains, and other bizarre dishes chosen more for their rarity than their taste. Whether these stories are true matters less than what they reveal, that Romans who disapproved of Elagabalus used food as a way to communicate their disgust with his rule. What made Elagabalus particularly scandalous wasn't just the expense of his feasts, but the way he disregarded social hierarchies. He would invite people of all classes to dine together, seating senators next to actors and foreign priests. This mixing of social levels was deeply disturbing to traditional Romans who believed that hierarchy should be maintained in all contexts. A feast that ignored social distinctions was, in their view, an attack on the natural order itself. Elagabalus saw things differently. For him, the feast was a sacred space where earthly hierarchies dissolved in favor of spiritual communion. He believed that abundance and pleasure were divine gifts to be celebrated by all people, regardless of their social station. This was a revolutionary idea, one that Rome was not ready to accept. His reign was brief, lasting only 4 years before he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. He was 18 years old when he died. The hostile accounts that followed painted him as the worst kind of tyrant, using his feasts as evidence of his unfitness to rule. For centuries afterward, his name was invoked as a warning about what happens when proper restraint gives way to unbridled indulgence. But perhaps we should read these stories differently. Perhaps Elagabalus was not simply mad or excessive, but rather someone whose cultural background and religious beliefs made him fundamentally incompatible with Roman expectations. His feasts scandalized Romans, not because they were inherently wrong, but because they challenged core assumptions about propriety, hierarchy, and the proper relationship between pleasure and power. As we consider these tales of Roman feasting, we must also consider the nature of historical evidence itself. How do we know what we think we know about these events? What are our sources, and what biases did they bring to their accounts? The primary sources for Roman imperial history are problematic in multiple ways. Writers like Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and the authors of the Historia Augusta were not neutral observers. They were members of the senatorial class, often writing about emperors they personally disliked or whose policies had harmed their class interests. Suetonius, who provided detailed accounts of the early emperors' private lives, wrote during the reign of Hadrian, decades after most of the events he described. He relied on gossip, rumor, and earlier accounts that may themselves have been unreliable. His biographies read almost like tabloid journalism, filled with scandalous details that may or may not be true, but are certainly entertaining. Tacitus, perhaps the greatest of Roman historians, wrote with obvious bias against certain emperors. His portrait of Tiberius, for instance, is almost uniformly negative, depicting the emperor as suspicious, cruel, and debauched. Yet other evidence suggests Tiberius was actually a capable administrator who maintained peace and prosperity. Tacitus's personal disappointment with imperial rule colored his entire historical project. These historians had a particular literary tradition they followed. Roman and Greek biographical writing expected certain elements, descriptions of the subject's character, anecdotes illustrating virtues or vices, dramatic speeches, and moral lessons. Historical accuracy was less important than literary effectiveness and moral instruction. When writing about emperors they disliked, these historians would include standard accusations of excess, cruelty, and sexual impropriety. These were topoi, conventional elements that readers expected. Just as modern political scandals follow predictable patterns, ancient character assassination followed formulas. A bad emperor would be depicted as gluttonous, lustful, and wasteful. These weren't necessarily descriptions of actual behavior. They were shorthand, for this ruler was illegitimate and tyrannical. Archaeological evidence provides some counterbalance to the literary sources. The dining rooms discovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum show spaces that were luxurious but not wildly excessive. The serving vessels and kitchen equipment suggest elaborate cuisine but within reasonable bounds. The frescoes on dining room walls depict food and drink, but they emphasize abundance and beauty rather than chaos or debauchery. Food remains and cooking equipment tell us what Romans actually ate and how they prepared it. This physical evidence suggests that while wealthy Romans certainly enjoyed elaborate meals, the everyday reality was probably less extreme than the literary sources suggest. Most feasts were celebrations of prosperity and culture, not descents into madness. Christian writers added another layer of distortion. Writing centuries after the events they described, they had theological reasons to emphasize pagan corruption. For them, Roman excess wasn't just morally wrong, it was proof that pagan religion led to societal decay. Their accounts of Roman feasts became moral parables rather than historical descriptions. By the Middle Ages, the concept of the Roman orgy had become completely divorced from reality. It existed as a symbolic concept, representing the corruption that supposedly caused Rome's fall. Medieval writers and artists depicted Roman feasts as chaotic scenes of sin, using them as warnings about the dangers of earthly pleasure. These images shaped European understanding of Rome for centuries. So, when we speak of Roman feasts, we must acknowledge that we're working with deeply flawed sources. We know that wealthy Romans hosted elaborate dinners. We know that food and wine were important parts of social and political life. We know that some emperors became notorious for their indulgence. But the specific details, the scandalous stories that have captured imaginations for 2 millennia, must be approached with skepticism. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Roman feasts were not innocent dinner parties, but neither were they scenes of total chaos. They were complex social rituals where pleasure, politics, and performance intermingled. They reflected both the best and worst of Roman culture, sophisticated appreciation for food and art, alongside problematic displays of wealth and power. What endures is not the historical reality, but the myth. The idea of the Roman orgy has become a permanent part of Western imagination, a symbol we use to think about luxury, excess, and the fall of civilizations. Whether the original feasts were actually as extreme as legend suggests matters less than what the stories reveal about the people who told them and the cultures that believed them. In the quiet evening of time, as empires rise and fall like breath, these stories persist. They comfort us by suggesting that decline has clear causes, that excess always brings punishment, that moral failure explains historical change. They allow us to feel superior to the past, while secretly fascinated by it. And in this way, the Roman feast continues to serve a social function, just not the one the original participants intended. As we step back from these tales of Roman banquets, both real and imagined, we might consider what they've left behind. Not just in historical record, but in how we think about civilization, about power, about the relationship between pleasure and virtue. The transformation of Roman feasting from historical reality into cultural myth tells us something important about how stories evolve. Each generation that retold these tales added their own concerns, their own moral lessons, their own fears and fascinations. The Roman feast became a mirror in which later societies saw reflections of themselves. Medieval Christians saw in Roman feasts a cautionary tale about paganism's corruption. Renaissance humanists saw sophisticated cultural achievement mixed with moral failure. Victorian moralists saw the dangers of unchecked appetite. Each era found in these ancient dinners whatever lessons they needed to learn or teach. What the original participants experienced, we cannot truly know. We can imagine the flickering lamplight, the sound of conversation and laughter, the smell of exotic dishes and perfumed oils. We can picture the careful social choreography, the subtle negotiations of power conducted over wine cups. But the lived experience of those evenings, the thoughts and feelings of actual participants, those are lost to time. What remains are the structures. Archaeological sites preserve the dining rooms, the kitchens, the serving vessels. We can measure the couches, examine the frescoes, analyze food residues. These physical remnants provide a kind of truth that texts cannot, offering evidence of actual practices rather than literary constructions. And what remains, too, is the idea. The Roman feast as concept, as symbol, as warning or inspiration, depending on one's perspective. It has become part of our collective vocabulary, a shorthand way of talking about excess, about the corruption of power, about the relationship between civilization and its own appetites. In a strange way, the myth of Roman feasting serves some of the same purposes that the actual feasts once did. It allows us to think about display and restraint, about public and private behavior, about how societies manage luxury and inequality. The conversation continues, even though the original participants have been silent for 2,000 years. Now, let us journey far from Roman dining rooms, far from the Mediterranean warmth and marble columns. We travel north and west, to the cold lands of Scandinavia, to a people whose relationship with their bodies and with permanence took a very different form. The Vikings, those seafaring warriors and traders who ranged from North America to Constantinople, left their marks in many ways. They built ships, established trade routes, founded cities, and yes, they raided and conquered. But they also left marks of a more intimate kind, marks on the skin itself. In the 10th century, an Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered Norse traders along the Volga River. Among his observations, recorded with the careful attention of someone documenting an unfamiliar culture, was a note about the women he saw. They bore, he wrote, markings from their fingertips to their necks, designs in dark blue and green that adorned their skin. These were tattoos, though Ibn Fadlan might not have used that word. To him, they were mysterious and striking, part of what made these northern people different from those he knew. His account, brief as it is, provides one of the few historical references to Viking tattooing practices. Most of what we think we know must be reconstructed from other evidence: archaeological finds, mythology, comparative cultural practices. The skin, unlike stone or metal, does not survive the centuries. No tattooed Viking flesh remains for us to examine. We have tools that might have been used for tattooing, pigments that could have been ink, but the actual marked skin has long since returned to Earth. So, we must piece together the story from fragments, from implications, from educated guesses. What we can say with some confidence is that tattoos, if Vikings wore them, would have served multiple purposes. In a culture where oral tradition preserved history and identity, where writing was limited and sacred, the body itself became a kind of text. Marks on skin could declare lineage, devotion to particular gods, achievements, or simply aesthetic preferences. The colors Ibn Fadlan described, blue and green, suggest specific pigments. The deep blue likely came from ash or soot mixed with plant materials, creating an ink that would remain visible against pale northern skin. Green might have come from copper compounds or plant dyes. These weren't casual decorations. Creating lasting marks on skin required knowledge, skill, and considerable pain tolerance. In Norse culture, pain was not something to be avoided, but rather something to be endured with dignity. The sagas praise stoic acceptance of suffering. A person who could withstand pain without complaint earned respect. Receiving a tattoo, then, would have been not just decoration but demonstration, proof of one's ability to endure. The placement of tattoos mattered. Hands and arms, always visible during work or trade, displayed marks that announced identity constantly. Neck and chest placements were more intimate, perhaps reserved for symbols of personal faith or family connections. Each mark told part of a person's story to those who knew how to read it. For Viking women specifically, tattoos may have served additional purposes. In a society where women could own property, manage households, and occasionally even lead raids, visible marks of strength and heritage made sense. These weren't women who hid their capabilities or their connections. They were visible, active participants in their culture, and their skin told their stories. If Vikings tattooed themselves, and the evidence suggests they did, what symbols did they choose? Here we must turn to the broader context of Norse art and mythology, looking for motifs that appear repeatedly and seem to carry particular significance. Runic symbols would have been obvious choices. The runes were more than an alphabet. They were magical signs, each one carrying meaning beyond its phonetic value. To inscribe a rune on one's skin was to invoke its power, to carry that magic with you always. The rune algaes, shaped like an upturned Y, represented protection. It was a shield in symbol form, offering spiritual defense against harm. A warrior or traveler might bear this mark, trusting in its protective power. Fehu, representing wealth and prosperity, might be worn by merchants or by anyone hoping to attract abundance. Berkana, associated with the birch tree, symbolized fertility and new beginnings. Women might choose this mark when hoping for children or embarking on new phases of life. Tiwaz, an upward-pointing arrow, honored the god Tyr and represented justice, courage, and sacrifice. Each rune was a prayer written in flesh. But tattoos likely included more than just runes. The art that survives on Viking jewelry, weapons, and ships shows a love of interlacing patterns, of knots that seem to have no beginning or end. These represented the interconnectedness of all things, the way past and future, fate and choice, life and death wove together into a single pattern. The world serpent, Jormungandr, who encircled the earth with his coils, appears frequently in Norse art. A serpent tattoo might represent protection through eternal vigilance, or perhaps the cyclical nature of existence. It reminded the bearer that all things return to their beginning, that endings are also beginnings. Ravens held special significance. Odin, the chief god, had two ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew across the world bringing him information. A raven tattoo connected the bearer to wisdom, to the god's sight, to intelligence and awareness. It was both homage and aspiration. Wolves, too, appeared often in Norse imagery. They represented ferocity in battle, but also loyalty to the pack. A wolf mark might declare the bearer's readiness to fight, or their devotion to family and clan. In Norse thinking, wolves were not simply dangerous animals, but complex symbols of both threat and kinship. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was perhaps the most common protective symbol in Viking culture. Worn as amulets carved into stones, it would certainly have appeared as tattoos. This simple T-shaped mark invoked the thunder god's protection, his strength, his role as defender of both gods and humans against the forces of chaos. The Valknut, 3 interlocking triangles, was associated with Odin, and with the slain warriors who joined him in Valhalla. This was a mark of courage, of willingness to die honorably in battle. It suggested that the bearer had dedicated themselves to the warrior's path, accepting its risks in exchange for its glory. Spirals and circular patterns might represent the wheel of the year, the turning of seasons, the cyclical nature of time itself. Norse culture was deeply attuned to seasonal changes, to the great cycles of light and dark, growth and dormancy. A spiral tattoo carried all of this meaning compressed into a simple, elegant form. These weren't random decorations. Each mark connected the bearer to something larger, to the gods, to ancestors, to the natural world, to abstract concepts like fate and courage. The tattooed body became a living text of faith and identity, readable by those who understood the visual language. The process of receiving a tattoo was likely ritualized, perhaps involving fasting, prayer, or the invocation of protective spirits. The person wielding the needle, whether a specialized artist or simply someone skilled in the craft, would have been trusted deeply. They were literally marking your flesh, permanently altering your body. This required complete trust, and perhaps spiritual preparation. Pain during tattooing might have been understood as a small echo of Odin's self-sacrifice. According to myth, Odin hung himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days and nights, wounded by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. Suffering for wisdom was a sacred act. The pain of tattooing connected the individual to that mythic moment, making them, in a small way, participants in divine sacrifice. When we think about Viking tattoos, we might consider what it means to write on flesh rather than stone or parchment. Stone endures for centuries, preserving messages long after their creators have died. Parchment can last for generations if properly cared for, but skin is temporary, lasting only a single lifetime before returning to dust. Yet there's something profound about choosing this temporary canvas. A tattoo says, "For as long as I live, I will carry this mark, this meaning, this connection." It's an acceptance of impermanence combined with a commitment to meaning during the time that remains. For Vikings, whose worldview included strong concepts of fate and destiny, this temporariness might have held particular significance. The Norns, those 3 sisters who wove the fates of all beings, determined the length of each life. No one knew when their thread would be cut. A tattoo was a way of choosing one's marks before fate made its final choice. Women bearing tattoos of protection carried those shields with them through childbirth, that most dangerous passage. The marks on their skin were prayers, constant petitions to the powers that might preserve life when so much could go wrong. Each morning, they woke, Those tattoos reminded them of their strength, their faith, their determination to survive. Travelers setting out on long journeys, whether for trade or raid, might receive new tattoos as part of their preparations. These marks were like talismans, portable protection that couldn't be lost or stolen. The ship might sink, the cargo might be stolen, but the tattoos remained, faithfully guarding their bearer across unknown seas. For those who died in battle far from home, tattoos became a form of identification. If the body was found and returned to family, the marks helped confirm identity when faces might be damaged beyond recognition. In this way, tattoos served an intensely practical purpose alongside their spiritual one. The marks also created community. When Vikings from different regions met, perhaps in distant trading posts, their tattoos provided instant connection. Similar symbols suggested shared beliefs, common heritage, mutual understanding. In a world of strangers, tattoos identified friends, or at least those who shared your worldview. As time passed and individuals aged, their tattoos aged with them. The sharp lines of youth became softer, blurred by the changes skin undergoes over decades. But this wasn't a flaw, it was a record. An old warrior's faded tattoos bore witness to a long life, to survival, to accumulated wisdom. They were honor badges earned simply by enduring. When someone died, their tattooed skin eventually returned to the earth, taking those marks with it. The symbols that had been so carefully chosen, so painfully inscribed, dissolved back into nature. This complete cycle, from unmarked birth to marked life to unmarked death, fit perfectly with Norse understanding of existence. All things arise, persist briefly, and pass away. The tattoo honored the persistence while accepting the passing. We should acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge about Viking tattoos. Ibn Fadlan's account is brief and describes what he saw in one specific place at one specific time. It cannot tell us whether all Vikings tattooed, or only some, whether the practices were universal or regional, whether they changed over time, or remained constant. Archaeological evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Sharp tools that might have been used for tattooing have been found in Viking Age sites. Pigment stones, used for grinding materials into powder, could have been for creating tattoo ink, or for a dozen other purposes. The interpretive gap remains large. Some carved figures from the Viking Age show what might be tattoo patterns. Small statuettes, decorative elements on ships, carved memorial stones, all these occasionally display patterns that could represent body markings. But they could also simply be artistic decoration with no connection to actual tattooing practices. Comparative evidence from other cultures is helpful but imperfect. We know that many circumpolar peoples practice tattooing. The indigenous peoples of North America, whom Vikings encountered briefly in Newfoundland, had tattooing traditions. Siberian peoples whom Vikings might have met through trade routes also marked their skin. Given this geographical context, Viking tattooing seems likely, but likelihood isn't certainty. Modern revival of Viking-style tattoos, while popular and often beautiful, tells us more about contemporary culture than historical reality. People today choose Norse symbols for their own reasons: aesthetic appeal, connection to heritage, appreciation for mythology. These modern choices don't necessarily reflect ancient practices, yet perhaps the uncertainty is itself meaningful. The lack of definitive evidence creates space for imagination, for connection, for personal interpretation. Those interested in Viking culture can engage with the question of tattoos as participants rather than just observers, bringing their own meanings to ancient symbols. What we can say definitively is that Vikings cared deeply about appearance, about presentation, about the messages bodies sent to observers. They braided their hair elaborately, wore fine jewelry when they could afford it, maintained their weapons and clothing with care. In a culture so attentive to visual communication, permanent body marking fits perfectly. The tattoos, if they existed as we imagine them, represented something profound about Viking worldview. They demonstrated that the sacred and the everyday were not separate realms, but intertwined. Your body was a temple, literally, bearing marks of devotion. It was also a practical tool for survival, for trade, for warfare. The tattoo unified these aspects, making the spiritual visible and the visible spiritual. Let us make one final journey, this time to the eastern shore of the Adriatic, to the rugged mountains and coastal waters where the Illyrian people made their home. Here, in what is now Albania and the surrounding regions, a kingdom rose and fell, leaving behind lessons about power, betrayal, and the crushing weight of empire. In the 2nd century BCE, King Gentius ascended to the Illyrian throne. He inherited a kingdom in a precarious position, surrounded by powers much greater than itself. To the east lay Macedonia, to the west across the Adriatic was Rome, and to the south were various Greek states. Illyria was a small fish in a pond of sharks, and everyone knew it. Gentius was young, proud, and determined to preserve his kingdom's independence. Unlike his father, who had maintained peaceful relations with Rome, Gentius was less inclined to bow to foreign pressure. He strengthened his navy, which controlled crucial Adriatic waters. He unified the fractious Illyrian tribes under his authority. He looked for allies who might help balance against Roman power. The kingdom Gentius ruled was not wealthy or populous compared to its neighbors, but it had advantages. The mountainous terrain made invasion difficult. The Illyrian people were fierce warriors with traditions of resistance. The coast provided access to maritime trade and naval power. With clever leadership, perhaps Illyria could maintain its freedom. But the world was changing rapidly. Rome was becoming unstoppable, systematically conquering the Mediterranean region. Perseus of Macedon, the last king of Alexander's dynasty, was desperately resisting Roman expansion. He needed allies, and Gentius needed support. The alliance seemed natural, two smaller powers uniting against the imperial juggernaut. The partnership, forged in mutual desperation, was doomed from the start. Perseus promised gold to fund Illyrian military efforts, but was slow to deliver payment. Gentius, needing resources immediately, took aggressive actions before receiving the promised support. He imprisoned Roman envoys, a diplomatic catastrophe that gave Rome the excuse it needed for war. Rome responded with characteristic efficiency. General Lucius Anicius Gallus marched into Illyria with veteran legions. What Gentius had hoped would be a prolonged conflict lasting months or years was over in weeks. The Roman military machine, honed by decades of constant warfare, simply rolled over Illyrian defenses. Town after town surrendered. Tribal allies melted away, choosing survival over solidarity. The promised Macedonian support never materialized. Perseus was fighting his own losing battle against Rome, and could spare nothing for his distant ally. Gentius found himself isolated, his treasury empty, his kingdom crumbling. The final confrontation came at Skodra, the Illyrian capital nestled in the mountains. Here, Gentius made his last stand. For a few days, Illyrian defenders rained arrows on the approaching Romans, hoping against hope that something might change, that reinforcements might arrive, that the situation wasn't as hopeless as it appeared. But hope is not strategy, and determination cannot defeat superior force indefinitely. The siege was brief. Hunger and despair replaced defiance. When the gates opened, Gentius emerged not as a warrior, but as a captive king, still wearing his royal robes, maintaining what dignity remained. The Romans, efficient as ever, catalogued his treasury, seized his ships, and took his family into custody. The kingdom of Illyria, which had existed for generations, was extinguished in a single campaign. Gentius was transported to Italy, where he participated in the ultimate humiliation, walking in chains through Rome during Anicius Gallus's triumph. displayed as proof of Roman supremacy. After the triumph, Gentius disappeared into comfortable captivity. He was kept under house arrest in Spoletium, central Italy, where he lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity. The exact date of his death is unrecorded. Perhaps he lived many years, growing old far from his mountains and sea, remembering the brief time when he had been a king. Perhaps he died relatively quickly, succumbing to the despair of captivity. History doesn't tell us. What we know is that with Gentius's fall, Illyrian independence ended. Rome divided the territory into administrative districts, taxed the population, and integrated the region into its growing empire. The Illyrian tribes, which had resisted foreign control for centuries, found themselves subjects of a power too vast to oppose. The story of Gentius reminds us of a truth that applies across time and place. Small powers caught between empires face impossible choices. Resist and be destroyed quickly, or submit and be absorbed slowly. There are no good options, only variations of loss. Gentius chose resistance, which at least had the virtue of honor if not wisdom. He stood against overwhelming power knowing he would likely fail. Whether this makes him heroic or foolish depends on perspective. To his people, watching their independence disappear, he was the last king who tried to preserve what their ancestors had built. To the Romans, he was just another minor obstacle briefly delaying the inevitable. His story also illustrates the danger of trusting allies who have their own pressing concerns. Perseus of Macedon likely meant well when he promised support, but good intentions cannot substitute for actual help. When crisis came, each kingdom faced Rome alone, picked off one by one, while potential allies watched helplessly or selfishly preserved their own resources. The betrayal Gentius experienced, both from his supposed ally and from his own tribes who surrendered to save themselves, is a recurring theme in history. Unity is strong in principle, weak in practice when individuals calculate their personal survival odds. The defectors who made deals with Rome probably lived longer than those who remained loyal to Gentius. Whether they lived better, whether they felt any shame, we cannot know. After Illyria fell, its people didn't disappear. They were absorbed into the Roman Empire, their warriors conscripted into Roman legions, their lands producing taxes for Roman coffers, their ports serving Roman trade. In time, some Illyrians rose to prominence within the empire. Centuries later, the region produced several Roman emperors, including Diocletian and Constantine. This ironic outcome, the conquered people eventually producing rulers of the empire that conquered them, suggests something complex about how empires function. Complete destruction was never Rome's goal. Absorption, integration, and ultimately transformation served better. The Illyrians lost their kingdom but in some sense infiltrated the structure that defeated them. The ruins of Illyrian settlements still dot the landscape of modern Albania and surrounding countries. Like the medieval castles we began with, these stone remnants outlasted the people who built them, the kingdoms that ruled them, the empires that conquered them. Stone endures when flesh and ambition have long since turned to dust. As we near the end of our journey through these historical landscapes, we might reflect on what connects these seemingly disparate stories. Medieval castles, Roman feasts, Viking tattoos, Illyrian kingdoms, what common thread runs through them all? Perhaps it's this: humans, across times and cultures, have always sought ways to make meaning permanent, to leave marks that outlast individual lifetimes. The castle builder carving stone, the Roman host staging elaborate feasts, the Viking bearing sacred symbols on skin, the Illyrian king defending his realm, all were engaged in the same fundamental project. They were saying, I was here, I mattered, remember me. Yet permanence is always relative. The castle stands for centuries but eventually crumbles. The feast ends, and even memory of it fades into legend and myth. The tattoo lasts a lifetime, but no longer. The kingdom falls, absorbed into something larger. Nothing truly lasts forever. But in the attempt to create permanence, in the effort to build, to mark, to defend, to preserve, humans reveal something essential about themselves. We cannot accept being temporary. We know intellectually that we are, that everything ends, but emotionally we reject this truth. So we build in stone, we inscribe on skin, we fight for independence, we stage spectacles, all as acts of defiance against the universal truth of impermanence. The medieval lord building his castle knew he would die long before the walls crumbled, but he built anyway. The Viking receiving a tattoo knew would last only their lifetime, but they bore it anyway. Gentius defending Scadra must have known at some level that Rome could not be defeated, but he resisted anyway. These weren't acts of ignorance, but of courage, of choosing meaning despite meaninglessness, of insisting on significance despite inevitable insignificance. The Roman feast in this light becomes something more than indulgence or political theater. It was an attempt to create moments of beauty and connection that would be remembered, even if imperfectly, even if distorted by later retellings. The guests reclining on those couches, eating those elaborate dishes, were participants in a performance that they hoped would echo forward through time. And in a sense, it has, even if not in the way they imagined. What survives, finally, is not the things themselves, but the idea of them. The physical castle may be ruins, but the concept of the castle, the cultural meaning it carries, remains vibrant. The actual Roman feasts are lost to time, but the story of Roman feasts continues to shape how we think about luxury and excess. The Viking tattoos have dissolved back into earth, but the idea of sacred marks on skin speaks to us still. The kingdom of Illyria is gone, but the story of its last king reminds us of truths about power and resistance. We remember these things, not because they were perfect, or because they succeeded in their aims, but because they represent something eternally human. The desire to build something lasting, the need to mark our passage through time, the hope that we might be remembered, if not forever, then at least for a while. And so, we come to rest here, at the end of our wandering through history. We've visited cold castles and warm dining rooms, imagined ink on northern skin, and traced the fall of a distant kingdom. These stories, some grand and some quiet, all remind us that history is not just about dates and battles and political movements. It's about people trying to live meaningful lives in the time they're given. The castle builder laying stones he'll never see completed, the Roman guest navigating a fraught social gathering, the Viking bearing marks of faith and heritage, the Illyrian king making his last stand. All of them were doing what we all do, making choices, hoping for good outcomes, trying to leave something behind that says we mattered. Their concerns were different from ours in detail, but similar in essence. How do we stay safe? How do we show who we are? How do we connect with something larger than ourselves? How do we resist forces that seem overwhelming? These are human questions, timeless questions, asked in every era in different languages, but with the same underlying urgency. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might hold these stories lightly, letting them settle into that space between waking and dreaming, where history and imagination blend. The castle walls still stand in your mind, solid and gray against a gentle sky. The Roman dining room flickers with lamplight, voices murmuring in a tongue you almost understand. The Viking trader shows you the marks on their skin, each one a story too complex for words. The Illyrian king stands on his walls one last time, watching the sun set over mountains that will outlast all kingdoms. These images need not trouble your rest. They are simply reminders that humans have always been here, living and struggling and building and hoping, leaving their marks in whatever ways they could. We are part of that long chain, adding our own small links, hoping they hold for a little while. Let these thoughts drift away now, like smoke from a dying fire, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. History will wait for you. The stories will still be there tomorrow. For now, there is only rest, only the gentle darkness, only the quiet breath of sleep settling over everything like snow falling on ancient stones. The castle stands in the night. The feast has ended, guests departed. The tattoo fades with its bearer. The kingdom falls, and the world continues turning, patient and vast and utterly indifferent to all human striving. And that's okay. It's enough to have been here, to have witnessed, to have listened to these echoes from the past. Tomorrow is another day, and these stories will keep. For now, let them go. Rest well.